Alright, well I'm about to do something very reckless, which is that I'm going to present without notes. So this presentation may end up being a lot shorter than expected. But I figure that anything that I don't remember to say in the moment is probably not worth sharing. So yes, let's go. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging that I am presenting from Wajak Noongar Budja, and likewise the research that I do takes place on Wajak Noongar Budja, and so I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm about 18 months into this research, so there's plenty more still to be uncovered, but basically I am looking at Lake Monger as a case study for how the environments that we live in are represented in the narratives that we tell, and how those narratives affect the way that we imagine those ecosystems existing in the future. So let's see if I know how to use the clicker. Good. So the analytical framework that I use comes from Narratology, which is the study of how we tell stories and how the stories that we tell affect the way we perceive the world around us. So we look at the generalizable characteristics of narratives, and narratives can take any form. I would say that everything that we know through story. Every object has a story or tells a story or came about because of some story. So with that understanding, we can apply narratology to anything, and we can look at what the narratives that we use to communicate tell us, and sometimes occlude from our understanding of the world around us. So I'm going to start by first talking about sustainability in general, so how we talk about sustainability as a concept, and how we spin that tale into being. And then I'm going to talk about I'm just going to give you one specific case study of an article about water management at Lake Monger from the early 2000s. So often when we talk about sustainability, we see this model, the 3 pillars model. It's been identified by Purvis, Mao and Robinson as the primary way that we understand and talk about sustainability. And you'll see it, often you'll see it as a Venn diagram, which doesn't really make sense because diagrams have certain logical properties, and that's not really a mathematical representation of the properties of sustainability. But what it's trying to communicate is that we talk about sustainability in terms of an economic component, a social component, and an environmental component. And given that we're calling them pillars, let's look at the pillar model. So these are the 3 pillars that support sustainability. They're characterized by Purvis et al. As potential benchmarks for measuring sustainability. But what the, representation as a pillar implies is that they don't just measure sustainability, they support sustainability. So the inference then would be, without these 3 pillars, sustainability would collapse. But let's talk about the pillars as individual entities. Now, obviously that's an abstraction in itself. We know that economy, society, environment, they don't exist in a vacuum. They, in a sense, they're all part of the same entity. You might often think of, society as being produced by environment and economy as being produced by social forces. But that's not what is implied in the story of the pillars. And we do often hear these, micro-narratives or narrative trends, particularly in talking about the economy and the environment. We talk about them as discrete, self-organizing systems that don't necessarily relate to each other. So I've included a quote from Godzilla. The arrogance of man is thinking nature is in our control and not the other way around. And that's a story that we tell a lot. We have plenty of stories that say if you abuse the environment, it will punish you for that. The environment or nature operates under its own laws, and it is not, the place of the human to try and meddle with those laws. Weirdly, we see the same narrative a lot for economy, and I've just realised that those are the wrong way around. So my quote for the economy is from a parliamentary debate in 2011. Tony Abbott said that this government's carbon tax is nothing short of economic vandalism. Why does the government want to destroy the economic foundation of those communities? So in this sort of rhetoric, we see that story of the economy as something that is a fundamental substrate of the world that we live in. It has its own natural laws, and if you break the laws of the economy, then the economy will punish you. So in this conceptualisation, in this story, and this is just one of the stories that we tell about the economy, but it's one that we tell a lot. So in these stories, both the economy and the environment are entities that are very much outside of our control. So that leaves us with only one pillar, only one lever that we can use to affect sustainability as a goal. The other two pillars really being pre-existing. So let's look at some of the other ways that we can model sustainability using these same components, and how the narratives implied by those different models might imply different logical arrangement of the components. So this is an A-frame of sustainability. We still have the same pillars, the environmental, the economic, the social, but if we were to configure the environment and the economy as outside of human control, then we're left with the social as the one strut that is forced to pull those two into alignment if we're to achieve sustainability goals at the top. So in this model, we understand sustainability first as coming from the social domain. If we're going to talk about sustainability, it has to start with what people do, what societies believe, and how they choose to bring the environment and the economy into alignment. I also have, here we go, this is the hammock of sustainability. This is effectively the same arrangement as the A-frame, but rather than having economy and environment supported by society, we have society supported by economy and environment. And this is an equally valid story to tell, because in a sense, our interface with economy and environment is produced socially, but also the society that we live in is produced by economy and environment. So these are similar but opposite configurations of the notion of sustainability. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that you can really tell any story that you want to about sustainability, and all of these stories will capture something of what sustainability means, but none of them will tell the full story. And by telling one, you'll invisibilize components of the other. So this is very relevant. Oh wait, no, there's one more. So this is the pyramid model of sustainability, and I would argue that this is probably a fairer representation of the relationship between those three pillars. You have environment existing as the substrate of society, and economy being produced by society. And only with those three supporting rungs or tiers of the pyramid do you achieve the goal of sustainability. So this is, I've included another political quote. We believe climate change will ultimately be solved by can-do capitalism. That was Scott Morrison last year. And in a sense, if we look at this pyramid, he's right, because economy is the tier that ultimately supports sustainability. However, what this fails to acknowledge is that economy is itself supported by society. So it's really up to social policy to influence the way the economy works if we want to achieve sustainability outcomes. And that is very much the antithesis of the, laissez-faire approach to economic management that the right-wing politics of Australia sort of advocates for. All right, so basically what I'm trying to communicate here is that the forces that produce sustainability, and also the forces that allow us to understand sustainability are produced socially through story. So let's move from here to a bit of discussion of my case study site, Lake Monger. And this is a site that's important to me. It's the area that I live. It's also important. It's one of the few remaining wetland areas in the immediate vicinity of the central business district. It's about 1 kilometre west of the city. It's important culturally, and it's important as an ecosystem. But it's also a space that has very much been transformed in the past 200 years into I suppose you'd call it a hybrid space. And so it's important to look at the narratives that we use to justify either transforming it further, or preserving it in its current state, or imagining a third path forward in managing a site like this. So I'm going to skip through this, but the analytical frameworks I'm using comes from Paul Graham-Raven, who is interested in utopia studies and future studies, but really this framework just gives us some tools to talk about how stories are put together, and I won't do too much of that. But there are, a nice piece of language is talking about diegetic and mimetic types of narratives. So diegetic narratives are, I suppose, more reliant on formal motifs and styles. So fairy tales all start with once upon a time and end with happily ever after, and that's a convention that doesn't necessarily communicate something about reality, but it works to frame the story. On the other hand, we have mimetic writing, which aims to come across as more naturalistic. And inevitably, all writing is some combination of formal devices and mimetic representations of the world around us. So the article that I briefly want to talk about is one by Lund and Davis, 2000. I don't know if anyone involved in that is in the room, but it's about management of water quality at Lake Monger through top-down and bottom-up strategies. So what that means is you can either manage water quality by managing the input of nutrients into the system at the bottom, or you can potentially manage it by managing the consumption of macrophytes, of plants that are growing in the lake and causing eutrophication, causing choking of the water, through, for example, management of insect populations and plankton populations that will consume algae within the lake. But that sort of places an artificial boundary around the ecosystem that we're talking about. So it has the bottom, where nutrients come in, and the top is where the insects consume plant life. But that is not the entirety of the ecosystem. The real lake contains all sorts of larger macrofauna, birds, and birds are a great example of something that breaks this geometrical top and bottom conception of the ecosystem, because birds will produce, they'll input nutrients into the system when they defecate. They release phosphorus from their bodies into the lake, which is, they're doing bottom-up management of the lake nutrients. But they're also doing top-down management when they consume insects and plants that are growing within the lake. So top and bottom are really artificial. They're diegetic constructs that a scientific article will use to talk about an ecosystem. And this geometry is very much artificial. You can, as soon as ducks are put into that top-down, bottom-up system, the top and the bottom fall out because ducks are doing work at both the top and bottom of that system. There are also a lot of diegetic devices in this writing and scientific writing in general that invisibilizes the presence of humans within the system. So whenever we talk about things that happen in the system or within the scientific rubric, we'll use the third-person passive voice, and we'll use a lot of passive grammar that means that things happen without it stating that humans did it. So it will say, for example, that fertilisation of the lawned area is managed, but it won't say who manages it. It just says is managed. Likewise, it will say water level is controlled, but this use of the passive voice means that humans don't actually take part in the story. They're sort of an invisible presence. And that has consequences for the way that we manage these ecosystems. These ecosystems are managed within the constraints of this top-down, bottom-up approach, for example, and within the established geographic constraints of the ecosystem, when we know that the buffer zones and catchment areas of places like Lake Monger extend far beyond the boundaries established in a scientific article like this. And that's not to knock the science is great, but along with the science comes this, these built-in storytelling devices that affect the way we think about management. So this is my concluding wall of text. It's just a summary. So the lessons that I'm trying to get across here are that the stories that we tell about society, economy, environment affect how we conceptualize sustainability. And that's something that's worth being sensitive to. Narratives and stories are effectively the medium of transmission of social forces, which are an important factor in sustainability, as we've heard across both days today, that it's ultimately people who drive sustainability efforts and conservation efforts. And the narratives that we transmit within the social sphere effectively make up the society that we have. I gave you a little bit of an example of scientific narratology. It was just a snapshot. But I wanted to conclude by talking about, I guess, a more optimistic example, because the examples I've given have sort of been of the way that our thoughts are sometimes constrained by the language we use and the stories we tell. So the geometry of our sustainability models and of our scientific models sometimes limit the way we think. But stories can also expand the way we think, and I wanted to acknowledge some great work by Sandra Wooltotten, Len Collard, and Pierre Horwitz. Pierre's here today, I believe. A particular article, Living Water, Groundwater and Wetlands in Nangara Nungabuja. I really like this article because we hear multiple stories. We hear a scientific account of the hydrology of the Swan Coastal Plain, and we also hear in the same article a Noongar story of the hydrology of the Swan Coastal Plain. And the world that we live in is more than the sum of its narrative parts. So by presenting these multiple narratives side by side, we get an expanded vision of the world that we are trying to sustain. So thank you very much.